In 1950, Detroit was one of the richest industrial cities in the United States. It was the capital of the auto age, a city where industrial wages could turn a factory job into a middle-class life, where a man without a college degree could buy a house, own a car, and raise a family on one paycheck. 1.85 million people lived here. Today, fewer than 650,000 remain. This is Detroit, and this is the story of how America's most famous industrial city lost more than 1.2 million people, and why the real story was never as simple as the cars left. Because Detroit did not collapse at its weakest moment. The decline began almost exactly at its peak. To understand why Detroit fell, you first have to understand why it existed at all. Look at a map. Detroit sits on the waterway linking Lake Erie to Lake Huron, near one of the great industrial corridors of North America. Iron ore could move from the upper Great Lakes. Coal could move from Appalachia. Timber, copper, rail lines, shipping lanes, and a border crossing all converged in one region. Before Detroit was a car city, it was a logistics city. And when heavy industry needed a place to gather parts, workers, capital, and transport, geography had already nominated Detroit. Then Henry Ford chose it too. In 1913, Ford's Highland Park plant began using the moving assembly line. The basic idea sounds obvious now. Do not make workers walk around the product. Move the product to the workers. But the result was revolutionary. The time required to assemble a Model T fell to roughly 90 minutes as the system matured. The assembly line did two things at once. It made cars cheap enough for millions of Americans to buy, and it made the work repetitive enough that many workers hated it. By late 1913, Ford's labor turnover had climbed to nearly 380%. People left so often that the company had to keep hiring just to stand still. So in January 1914, Ford announced the $5 day, an 8-hour workday at more than double the previous daily wage for many workers. It was not charity. It was industrial math. Pay people enough to stay and the assembly line keeps moving. Pay people enough to buy what they build and mass production gains mass consumers. That formula turned Detroit into a magnet. Between 1910 and 1930, the city's population tripled. Immigrants arrived from Europe. White and black migrants arrived from the American South. Black families fleeing Jim Crow came north for wages, safety, and a chance at a different future. The city was not equal. Discrimination was built into housing, schools, policing, and employment. But the industrial engine was so powerful that it still pulled people in by the hundreds of thousands. By World War II, Detroit was more than Motor City. It was the arsenal of democracy. At Willow Run, Ford eventually reached a production rate of one B-24 Liberator bomber every 63 minutes. The factory became a symbol of what American industry could do when machines, labor, and federal demand aligned. And in 1950, the census marked the peak, 1,849,568 people. Detroit was the fifth largest city in the United States. Its factories were legendary. Its wages were famous. Its downtown was full. Its tax base looked permanent. That same year, 1950, was also the turning point. Detroit would never grow again. Here is what most quick versions of this story get wrong. They start with the 1967 uprising or the oil crisis or Japanese imports. Those things mattered, but the numbers say the fall began earlier. From 1950 to 1960, Detroit lost roughly 180,000 residents. That happened before the 1967 riot, before OPEC, and before Japanese imports became the usual explanation for everything that went wrong. The real turn was structural. Three forces were already pulling the city apart. Force 1, the factories left the city before they left the region. The early auto plants were often multi-story urban factories. They were built for a young industry close to rail, suppliers, and workers, but post-war manufacturing wanted something different. Enormous single-story plants, automated lines, wide truck access, and cheap land. Detroit had density. The suburbs had space. So the Big Three did not have to abandon Michigan to weaken Detroit. They could move just outside the city line. In the 1950s, new plants opened across Metro Detroit, but the city itself missed the investment. The jobs were still in the region, but the tax base and the daily life of the industry were no longer anchored in the city. That distinction matters. Detroit did not lose everything in one dramatic moment. It was hollowed out by small distances. A factory moving 10 miles away, a family buying a house across the border, a store following customers to the suburbs. Force 2, public policy subsidized exit. After World War II, federally backed mortgages made suburban homeownership one of the best deals in American life. For many white families, a new house outside the city could be cheaper than renting inside it. But redlining and discrimination meant black families were often locked out of the same opportunity. The highway system then hardened that pattern into concrete. Freeways made suburban commuting easier, but they were also rooted through established urban neighborhoods. In Detroit, Black Bottom and Paradise Valley, historically black neighborhoods with churches, clubs, homes, and more than 300 black-owned businesses were devastated by urban renewal and freeway construction, including Interstate 375. The promise was modernization. The cost was displacement. Force 3. The city entered a tax doom loop. A city is not just a map. It is an operating system. Roads still need paving. Schools still need funding. Police and fire departments still cover the same land. Water, pipes, streetlights, parks, courts, and sanitation still have to function whether the city has 1.8 million residents or 1.2 million. When factories left, the tax base shrank. When families left, it shrank again. To maintain services, the city had to ask more from the people and businesses that remained. Higher taxes and weaker services then made leaving even more attractive. This is the doom loop. Less revenue leads to worse services. Worse services lead to more departures lead to less revenue, and each turn makes the next turn harder to stop. Then came July 1967. A police raid on an after-hours bar in a black neighborhood ignited 5 days of violence. 43 people were killed. More than 1,000 were injured. Hundreds of buildings were destroyed or burned. The deeper causes were not mysterious. Decades of housing segregation, police brutality, job discrimination, overcrowding, and the destruction of black neighborhoods in the name of renewal. The uprising did not start Detroit's decline. The decline was already 17 years old. But it accelerated the exodus and hardened perceptions of the city. In the 1970s alone, Detroit lost another 310,000 people. By the time the oil crises arrived and fuel-efficient Japanese cars gained ground, Detroit the city had already been weakened by forces that were older, slower, and harder to reverse. The 1970s turned decline into a system. The Big Three's dominance slipped. Automation reduced the number of workers needed to build each vehicle. Competition increased. Recessions hit. Plants closed or downsized. The city kept losing people. But Detroit's problem was not only job loss, it was mismatch. The city had been built for nearly 2 million people. Its roads, schools, pipes, blocks, and public costs reflected that scale, but the number of taxpayers kept falling. That meant Detroit had the fixed costs of a giant city and the revenue of a shrinking one. Politicians tried to restart growth with megaprojects: stadiums, casinos, the Renaissance Center, downtown redevelopment plans, and the People Mover. Some projects helped specific districts. Downtown would eventually revive, but none of them solved the basic arithmetic of a city losing population across vast residential neighborhoods. The decline became visible in everyday life. Abandoned houses multiplied, blocks emptied out, schools closed, services slowed, property values fell. And as the city became poorer, the people with the least ability to leave were often the people left carrying the heaviest burden. By the 2000s, the numbers no longer looked like ordinary decline. They looked like collapse. Between 2000 and 2010, Detroit lost 237,000 residents, about a quarter of its population in a single decade. Tens of thousands of buildings stood vacant. Streetlights failed. Emergency response times stretched. The city was spending more than it could sustainably raise. On July 18, 2013, Detroit filed for Chapter 9 bankruptcy protection. It was the largest municipal bankruptcy filing in American history at the time, with debts estimated around $18 to $20 billion. The symbolism was brutal. The city that had embodied American industrial power could no longer pay its own bills. Detroit exited active bankruptcy in December 2014, and the years since then are not simply a story of failure. Downtown, Midtown, Corktown, and the riverfront have seen real investment. The city has improved services in some areas. Recent population estimates have even shown signs of stabilization and growth, but recovery is not the same thing as restoration. Detroit is still far smaller than it was in 1950. It is still shaped by the land use, racial geography, and fiscal consequences of the post-war era. A revived downtown cannot automatically refill a city built for 3 times its current population. So why did Detroit fall? Not because of one riot. The decline was already underway, not simply because of Japanese cars. The factories and families had already been moving, and not because one mayor, one union, one company, or one decade made one fatal mistake. Detroit fell because it was a one-industry city whose central industry stopped needing the city in the same way. It fell because public policy made suburban exit easier for some people and forced displacement onto others. It fell because a shrinking tax base had to maintain the infrastructure of a much larger city, and it fell because success itself made the danger hard to see. That is the uncomfortable part. Nothing about that formula belongs only to Detroit. A dominant industry that suddenly needs fewer workers in fewer places. A housing system that rewards exit. Infrastructure that divides rather than connects. A tax base that weakens just as public needs rise. You can find pieces of that pattern in cities built around steel, coal, finance, oil, tourism, and even technology. The lesson is not that every boomtown is doomed. Cities can adapt. Industries can diversify. Policy can repair damage. But the repair has to begin before the spiral becomes visible from space. Detroit's fall did not begin when the world noticed abandoned buildings. It began when the city looked richest, strongest, and most permanent. Nobody standing in Detroit in 1950, in the capital of the auto age, believed the city would lose more than 1 million people. That is exactly why the story matters. The fall began at the peak. And the next Detroit may not look like Detroit at all. If you want more files like this one, subscribe. Next time, the island nation that went from one of the richest places on Earth per person to broke in a single generation.